Thanks for joining us on Washington Talk. I'm Connie Kim. While the world struggles to contain and fight the coronavirus, a year has passed since the second U.S.-North Korea summit. Despite U.S. efforts to bring North Korea back to negotiations, the denuclearization talks are at a standstill. We'll get an assessment of the post-Hanoi summit and challenges going forward.
We have to do the hard and detailed work of crafting a balanced roadmap, one that meets the interests of both the United States and the DPRK.
It showed itself that my country was cheated and betrayed by U.S.
In the studio with me is Robert Einhorn, Senior Fellow at Brookings Institution. Mr. Einhorn served as the State Department Special Advisor for Nonproliferation and Arms Control in the Obama administration. Also joining me is Eric Brewer, Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Brewer served as the Director for Counterproliferation at the National Security Council. He played a lead role developing the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign on North Korea. Thank you for coming in today.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Mr. Brewer, I want to start with you. The closely watched U.S.-South Korea military drills have been postponed due to concerns of the coronavirus. Many are skeptical that this will create some kind of room for diplomacy between the U.S. and North Korea going forward. Do you agree with this view?
Yeah, I don't see any reason that halt of those exercises due to the coronavirus is going to sort of somehow lead to diplomacy. I think North Korea and the United States are still quite far apart right now. The differences are significant. The United States has already taken steps to alter its exercises, so I don't see this as changing any of that.
Ambassador Einhorn, do you agree with this view?
Yes, I do. The North Koreans have complained about even the scaled back exercises over the last, a year or so. So I don't see this making any difference, really.
Mm-hmm. And I want to take a look at the Hanoi summit. Before the summit happened, there were expectations that the two sides were going to sign an agreement. So what do you think was the fundamental problem?
I think the problem with Hanoi and the real reason for failure is that the United States really should have come back with a counterproposal. It should have suggested some modest sanctions relief, but in exchange for more than Yongbyon, perhaps Yongbyon plus an undeclared North Korean facility outside of Yongbyon. But no counterproposal was made. The Trump administration decided to go big, and that was a mistake. We'll never know whether this was a missed opportunity.
Mm-hmm. But after the summit, President Trump does seem happy that we are not seeing any North Korea's nuclear or ICBM testings. So do you think this is half the success of the summit tree?
I mean, don't get me wrong, it's obviously a good thing that North Korea is not testing ICBMs or other long-range systems. But I think that success is pretty tentative. North Korea has gone through other periods where it's ceased missile testing and nuclear testing. And the fact remains that Kim Jong-un can turn these back on fairly quickly, particularly the missile tests. Might take him a little bit longer on the nuclear front, but he can certainly resume those tests whenever he'd like.
Let me just add to that. At the party plenum at the end of December, Kim Jong-un indicated that North Korea was going to go forward with its strategic nuclear programs. And people were expecting that perhaps there would be a nuclear test or a test of an ICBM range missile. That hasn't happened yet. And I think President Trump is very happy that that hasn't happened yet. He wants the status quo to prevail, no major provocations. President Trump is in an election year. He wants the public to believe that his North Korea policy is still alive. It still can succeed. And a major test, I think, would would be unwelcome in the White House. So yes, he would like the status quo of no major provocation to prevail throughout the year. We'll see if that happens.
Mm-hmm. But we've seen North Korea's short-range and mid-range ballistic missile tests since May. So how far do you think North Korea's WMD programs and its delivery systems have come so far?
Well, despite the moratorium observed so far on nuclear testing and ICBM testing, they continue to make progress. They're continuing to produce fissile material for the weapons program. Presumably, they're increasing the number of nuclear weapons. The short-range tests, they're able to improve the accuracy, the reliability, the ability of short-range missiles to penetrate U.S. and allied defenses. Whereas Trump may be happy that no ICBM tests are taking place, our allies, South Korea and Japan, are not very happy that the North continues to improve its short-range missile capabilities, as well as its efforts to achieve a survivable deterrent with submarine-based ballistic missiles.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if I could add on that too. I mean, I agree with all the points that Bob made, and I think there's still somewhat of a tendency, I think, to ignore or somewhat downplay North Korea's nuclear capabilities and missile capabilities. And the fact is, they've advanced significantly over time, right? And so, and Bob mentioned the submarine capability as well. So, which is something that is now somewhat, in some circles laughable that North Korea is trying to develop this capability. But, I think that's a long-term thing that we do have to worry about.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of moving the talks forward, there seems to be a consensus in Washington that we need to have an end goal of the agreement, which is denuclearization, but also take step-by-step measures in denuclearization steps. So what do you think should be the goal of an interim deal here then?
I think a good interim goal to shoot for a good interim deal would be a verifiable freeze on all fissile material production. And I emphasize all fissile material production and verifiable in that statement. I think this would go beyond what North Korea put on the table in Hanoi, which was mostly just facilities that are at the Yongbyon complex, and it would need to require any other area where North Korea is producing fissile material, which would require North Korea to declare those facilities. It would also require that cessation to be verifiable.
I agree with Eric on that. I think the goal of an interim deal should be to cut off the production of bomb-making material. If you can do that, they're not going to add to the number of nuclear weapons and so forth. However, we shouldn't underestimate the difficulties of that. Eric alluded to the verification required. The North would have to declare, it would have to give us a list of all of these facilities related to enrichment and reprocessing anywhere in the country. The United States and South Korea would compare that list with our intelligence estimates, and I'm guessing there would be discrepancies. And the International Atomic Energy Agency would have to visit suspect sites. So it could be hard to verify, and the North won't like that kind of intrusive inspection. So I would suggest moving in stages. I would think an interim deal should start with Yongbyon, shut down Yongbyon. I would say 12 months later, add a couple of undeclared facilities outside of Yongbyon, maybe the Kangsan facility, which has gotten a lot of media attention. After 12 more months, I would say, okay, it's got to be nationwide. So provide a chance for the North Koreans to come forward with an honest, accurate list, and it will take that long to kind of to clarify that list and to deal with discrepancies. But I agree with Eric. That should be the focus of an interim deal.
Mm-hmm. So the common denominator here seems to be putting a cap on North Korea's nuclear capabilities. So if we get that, what should the U.S. side show to the North Koreans as a counter proposal?
Yeah, the North Koreans never do anything for free. They will require some kind of compensation. For an interim deal, a cap, I think there are a number of things we could offer. In addition to a declaration ending the Korean War, perhaps establishing liaison offices in Pyongyang and Washington, humanitarian assistance, perhaps a permanent or interim scaling back of joint ROK-US military exercises. But I also believe there has to be some sanctions relief. I would start with sanctions relief that enables certain inter-Korean projects to go forward. The Kaesong Industrial Complex, the Kumgang Mountain tourism project. But I'd also look at some of the UN sanctions that have to do with North Korea's imports. When North Korea imports commodities, it has to use hard currency or it has to draw down reserves. I think we should not be concerned. Allow the North Koreans to import as much petroleum products as they would like. Allowing them to export is more difficult. Coal, seafood, textiles, and so forth, because they earn hard currency there. I think those should probably be off limits for an interim deal. But I think there are other kinds of sanctions relief that could be possible.
Mr. Brewer, you played a lead role in coming up with the administration's maximum pressure campaign and executing it. Do you think at this point, when there's a deadlock between the U.S. and North Korea, do you think the U.S. should be putting more emphasis on implementing sanctions or imposing additional sanctions?
So I think there's certainly room for the United States to take some steps to increase the pressure on North Korea. So I think there are some steps the United States could take. I think one of the ripest areas for that would be sanctions on, what we would call third parties or secondary sanctions on, what are non-North Korean entities. So those companies, individuals, banks, businesses across the world that are based in other countries that are involved in assisting and aiding North Korean illicit activity. I think, and that was a big part of the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, because by doing that, you are targeting entities that are actually connected to the U.S. financial system more often than not, right? So I think there's some small ways where you can start to increase that pressure, because right now, I think, if we're being honest, any forward movement at the United Nations, the Security Council, for strengthening sanctions, I think is a non-starter right now with Russia and China. I think the administration knows that. And so absent some major North Korean provocation, I think that's probably a route that's not going to bear a lot of fruit right now. But that's not to say there aren't other things that we can do in the interim.
I agree. Russia and China are now in New York at the UN trying to get a resolution to relax sanctions. So new sanctions at the Security Council, I think, are not on the table at the moment. But in terms of UN sanctions, the priority should be enforcement of existing sanctions. We've seen enforcement beginning to erode recently. We see Russian and Chinese entities assisting North Korea. And I think the top priority for international sanctions should be enforcement rather than new sanctions.
We're hearing a lot of comments about how the U.S. should focus on implementing sanctions, because there's been criticism that the maximum pressure campaign has weakened as well on the international front as well. I also want to take a look at South Korea's role. Do you think South Korea has played an effective mediator role in conveying accurate positions to both sides?
I think early on, in the run-up to Singapore, President Moon and South Korea played a critical role in bringing President Trump and Kim Jong-un together. Absolutely critical. I think as the negotiations became more difficult, and especially over the last year, President Moon has tried his best to play a positive mediating role. But there are limits to what a mediator can do. When you're trying to bring two sides together who hold very strong opposing views, there are limits to what a mediator can do.
Do you think President Moon has given too much of a high hope to both sides?
Well, mediators often do that. They want to encourage the two sides to come together. So in briefing each side about the positions of the other, maybe they provide a kind of rosy picture in the hope of encouraging the two sides to come together.
And in the beginning of the year, South Korean President Moon said that the inter-Korean cooperation is going to expedite U.S.-North Korea talks. This is a position that he has shown before. Do you think it'll work this time around?
I'm skeptical of that. I don't think there's a lot of juice left in that squeeze right now because of the gap between North Korea and the United States, and because I think North Korea doesn't really, I don't think it sees that role for South Korea right now as a mediator. I think Kim probably believes he has the upper hand in that relationship and that he's capable of reaching out directly to Washington, to President Trump, if he wants to.
And before we go on to the next topic, I briefly want to ask, it seems that North Korea is taking a wait-and-see approach with the presidential elections coming up. Do you see any potential for an opening for diplomacy between the two sides?
You mentioned wait and see. I think the North Koreans are taking a look at American domestic politics. They see the U.S. is in an election year. I think there may be no engagement as the North Koreans wait to see who's going to be president in January 2021. They want to see whether there's going to be a presidential transition. My guess, and it's only a guess, is that their decision on engagement won't be taken until after the U.S. election. I would recommend that the Trump administration actually go public on, I think, the very reasonable position it took in Stockholm when Steve Biegun met his counterpart last October. The North Koreans rejected it out of hand. But I think going public with that position now is not going to lead to early agreement, but I think it could put the North Koreans on the defensive. It could show the world, the Chinese and the Russians as well, that the U.S. does have a reasonable position, much more reasonable than many people think.
I think Kim Jong-un recognizes that the type of deal that he would want and the type of deal that he would be willing to accept is not the type of deal that Trump can probably provide right now because of the election, right? I mean, President Trump is not going to be in a position to grant the type of sanctions relief that Kim Jong-un was asking for. So I think the evolution of the U.S. position somewhat sends Hanoi where Trump made the sort of, go big or go home offer. I think now it is more, more of a flexible process, more of an endorsement of a step-by-step approach. I think, Bob's right, in the conversations in Stockholm, the U.S. genuinely did come with new ideas, new proposals, not obviously to the degree that North Korea wanted or expected. It wasn't the Hanoi deal, but there is, I think, greater flexibility there than there was, at the table in Hanoi.
Right. The U.S. has been very flexible on its negotiating position. We'll leave it here for now and move on to our next topic.
We will be providing them again with the lab reagents to be able to make the diagnosis.
The UN Security Council Sanctions Committee on North Korea approved sanctions exemptions to organizations that have requested to provide assistance to North Korea in fighting the coronavirus. Amid the international sanctions regime, how will the coronavirus affect North Korea? So Ambassador Einhorn, a former WHO official who had experience in North Korea, has told VOA that temporary sanctions relief should be needed to help fight the coronavirus in North Korea. Do you agree on the need for this?
Well, I'm not an expert in the spread of these viruses. Sure, I think some temporary assistance could be of value. How much value, I don't know, because we know very little about the spread of the virus in North Korea, if at all. And you have to have a better picture of what's going on in the country to know what kind of assistance can be helpful.
Mm-hmm. So right now we're not seeing any confirmed cases officially from North Korea of the coronavirus. North Korea is requesting assistance from Russia and international organizations right now. Do you see the necessity for a temporary sanctions relief on this front?
It looks like right now that some of those requests and some of the granting of that assistance is in process. And so I think that's a good thing. I think we should be looking at ways to provide that type of assistance to help North Korea combat the coronavirus. But it's still a pretty opaque picture as to what's taking place. And so there needs to be obviously a dialogue and a conversation about what exactly is needed to do that.
If we look at the list of items that were exempt from sanctions, they include personal protective equipment and medical machinery. So how far do you think these sanctions exemptions should go? What should be the range of these sanctions exemptions?
Well, I think that's something that we need to continue to look at. And I think it has to be a conversation amongst, North Korea, the World Health Organization, and other parties to look at exactly what's needed and to figure out what that scope looks like and how to expedite that process.
And the State Department had previously said it's going to approve assistance to North Korea to help international organizations fight the coronavirus. Many have expressed skepticism that this is going to provide room for diplomacy between the two sides. Do you agree with this view?
I share that skepticism. Look, it's good for the United States to make these humanitarian gestures. If it can alleviate suffering in the North, it should take steps to do that. But we should be under no illusion that this is going to result in a more flexible North Korean position on the key issues that divide the United States and North Korea.
And also, I want to take a look at why North Korea hasn't responded to the U.S.'s proposal. It's requested assistance to the WHO and Russia for diagnostic kits. Why do you think North Korea is not responding to the U.S. proposal?
So I think it's fair to say that North Korea doesn't want to be in a position where it's sort of acknowledging that it needs U.S. assistance, right, on this front. It doesn't want to appear that it's sort of subservient to or dependent upon the United States. So that could potentially be one explanation.
What do you think of North Korea's silence about the U.S.'s proposal?
Again, I agree with Eric. The North doesn't want to appear beholden to the United States and to U.S. assistance. I understand maybe they may be more receptive to assistance from Russia. I think their silence is, first of all, their silence is an indication that they don't want to be very transparent about this. I think the more they say, the more that they will be expected to continue saying. So I don't think we're going to hear very much from North Korean authorities.
And I want to take a look at the economic aspects as well. So North Korea shut down its borders for almost a year now. How do you think this is going to impact their economy going forward? It must have taken a big toll considering they haven't had any official trade with North Korea and they've shut down tourism with China.
Yeah, the Chinese tourism has been a huge source of hard currency for the North. The Chinese have kind of circumvented sanctions by, through food aid, through tourism. But if there's going to be a halt to Chinese tourism in North Korea, that's going to be a significant blow to the North.
How much of an economic impact do you forecast?
I think the tourism hurts. I think, the shutdown of the borders and trade will certainly hurt. But I also think we should keep in mind that even in that environment, right, I think we can still expect North Korea to be carrying out a lot of its typical tactics to evade sanctions that will generate hard currency.
And we'll have to see what the official data between North Korea and China comes out to be after all. All right, we'll leave it here and move on to our next segment. Now for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea photo of the week. Today we have a picture of a horse ranch located on the outskirts of Pyongyang. North Korea has a history of buying pricey horses from Russia and it recently imported 12 purebred horses worth some $75,000 from Moscow. Well, we see that the people are also having masks on due to the coronavirus impact. What do you make of this photo?
So, I think, this speaks, in my mind, this speaks to the regime's ability to still prioritize and still get things that it wants across the border. And so, that is true in the current environment with the coronavirus, and it's also true in the sense that the ongoing challenge of combating sanctions evasion and things of that nature.
It kind of underlines the paradox, which is North Korea. You have these beautiful-looking horses. I don't know where they're from, but then you have the riders wearing face masks, given the current virus. It's still a very reclusive country, and I think this is an indication of that.
All right, I think that's all the time we have for this week. Thank you for coming in today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. That does it for today's Washington Talk, and from all of us here at Voice of America, thank you for watching. This has been Connie Kim.